Hello, everybody. Welcome to SoCal Livers, now worldwide. And today we are excited. We get to hear from Scott Binner on raising a looping type 1 daughter into her teenage years. Better him than me, I can't even imagine. But he is live if you've listened to Juicebox podcasts or you follow him on all his different multimedia events, and if you've read his book, which you should, he's entertaining, he's fascinating, he's very interesting. Let me do my normal disclaimer. We're talking about the do-it-yourself loop, and the loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm and user interface developed through the work of community volunteers. While this may seem obvious, please consult with your healthcare professionals regarding your diabetes management. Anything we say here is not medical advice, it's how we do things. Important, remember that this project is highly experimental and is not FDA approved for therapy. Therefore, you take full responsibility for building and running the system, and you do so at your own risk. So that's all I've got on the disclaimer. The way that we are going to run this meeting today is we keep everyone muted, and we have all our admins on today. And as Scott talks today, we will be gathering all the questions that come in on Zoom and on Facebook, and we will bring the questions to Scott directly. If you don't know about Scott, shame on you, but let me tell you, he is a stay-at-home dad, a husband, a storyteller. This is really true. I'm learning about that. A type 1 diabetes advocate and an author. He's the host and producer of Juicebox Podcast and writer on Arden's Day. Arden is his daughter, and #bold with insulin. He says, I love my family, baseball, and sitting in a dark movie theater with my wife, Kelly, and our children, Cole and Arden. And that's in times without COVID. He says he loves to tell stories, but when he started his blog in 2007, he turned this into Arden's Day website, and he wrote about being a father and a type 1 diabetes caregiver to his, as he say, wonderful daughter, Arden. The blog is a real life and transparent look at life with type 1 diabetes. He also wrote, I don't know if it's best-selling, but I'll say it is, best-selling book called Life is Short, Laundry is Eternal, Confessions of a Stay-at-Home Dad. It was published in 2013. Go on Amazon, buy it right away, no later than midnight tonight. He says type 1 diabetes advocacy has been his passion since he learned how powerful and renewing this community, this diabetes community can be for all of us who live with it. With that, I am going to turn this over to Scott. Thank you so much for taking your time. Thank you for being here. And what a delight to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And thank you for what I'm imagining is like 100 extra clicks on my blog this month while you were reading all that. So I appreciate that. I will sell some ads on your clicks, and thank you very much. As you can all see, I was on a baseball field today. I apologize for being the color of Glenn's shirt right now, but my face is just, and I was wearing sunglasses, so I have raccoon eyes, and I apologize. Try not to look at that if you absolutely can. Joanne was just much too kind and made me a little embarrassed, and I had to look away a couple of times because I started feeling a little silly inside. But I guess I could give you a tiny bit of background, and then I would tell you the things I want you to know, and then I'll tell you something about Loop. I don't think I'm going to be the greatest. I don't want to say that I'm not great at Loop, but I am really great at using Loop. I just probably will not use it in the way that most of you talk about. So hopefully that won't be horrible. Hopefully in the middle, Joanne won't be like, why did we let him on, and just shut the whole thing off. Like Joanne said, my daughter Arden has type 1 diabetes. She was diagnosed when she was just a couple weeks past her second birthday. She's turned 16 just in July. So she's been living with type 1 for 14 years now. She started pumping with the Omnipod when she was 4. And I think we started Dexcom maybe at the Dexcom 7 or 7 Plus, in that range. Prior to my understanding of things, Arden's A1C was constantly in the 8s. I struggled for years to get it into the 7s. I thought that getting an insulin pump would fix that. It did a little bit. I think I knocked like a half of a point out of her A1C with an insulin pump. The first time I got her A1C into the 7s, I hugged a nurse that I didn't know in the doctor's office and cried on her shoulder because it moved like 0.2. I actually got it from 8.1 to 7.9, and I just exploded because it felt like I climbed 3 mountains, and every time I got to the top, somebody just added another mountain. It was horrifying at times. But still, I didn't understand in any meaningful way diabetes. And so one day I asked my daughter's nurse practitioner, I said, if I gave you a magic wand, what's one thing you would do for people with type 1 diabetes? And without really thinking, she said, I'd tell them not to be afraid of insulin, and I would just make them not afraid of insulin. So I went home, and I had a job back then, a kind of a side gig writing for the Omnipod blog. And so when the year turned over and they asked me what I wanted to write about in the following year with my 6 blog posts I was going to get to write, I told them I was going to write about not being afraid of insulin. And I spent the whole year putting together these long, stories that as I look back on them, I realized that I was talking myself into not being afraid of insulin. I wasn't really instructing other people on how to do it because I was incredibly afraid of it. And I realized if I didn't get over that leap, nothing else would come true. So I'm writing for them. I'm writing on my blog, starting to come up with these ideas and concepts. And I started to get her A1C to come down. Like I said, 7.9, then all of a sudden it was 7.6 and 4, and then it went into the 6s and through the 6s. And before I knew it, she was 6.2. And I told my wife, I was like, I don't know what to call it, but there's a thing here. And if you do it, this is what happens to your A1C, because my daughter has no diet restrictions whatsoever. She had pancakes this morning that she made herself. Yesterday we had cheeseburgers, and then the day before she had a big salad for dinner. So she's all over the place, but there's no, I don't have to say to myself, oh, we're going to have Chinese food on Saturday and plan for it for 3 days. Like if you brought her up here right now and she had food in her hand, we could bolus for it. And anyway, I'm going to go through the things that I kind of learned and how I put them together. And then I'll tell you how I translated them to Loop, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. I think it's possible that I think about diabetes in a rather different way from most people. And I think maybe, moreover, I have a way of talking about it that's easy to follow. And Kenny, you could nod if you believe that that's true. See, Kenny completely agrees. I'm weirded out that I can't hear some people, by the way. I'd like to hear a little background.
You want to hear me? Is that helpful?
That's perfect. Yes, somebody else to be here. That'd be perfect.
It sounds good.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to put some slides up real quick, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And don't worry, mostly, to be perfectly honest, you don't really need these slides. I could talk you all through it, but let me just pop up a couple anyway. I'm not 100% sure I'm going to do this right.
I believe in you.
I do too.
Well, do you see a slide?
Not yet.
Yeah, well then stop believing. So hold on a second. Hold on.
Yeah, share screen. Yeah.
I got it. Don't you worry. I'm on top of it. Okay, does everybody see this?
Yes.
Good job.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
So, like I said, what would happen was I'd figure something out on the blog, I'd write something, and then I just keep writing about it, do it in my real life. I'm very careful about how I share online. If I say something about diabetes online, it is tried and true. I've used it to death and it works. I would never I wouldn't have an idea today and blurt it out tomorrow. I use it and use it and use it again. So the first thing I recognized is that just this, I'm going to have to be aggressive and bold and stop being afraid. The next thing I've noticed for most people, including my daughter, and all the myriad of people who send me their graphs, which I wish I never would have said out loud that I do, but almost everyone's graph that comes to me who's struggling with highs, people are misusing their basal insulin. And so whether it's in looping or in regular life, it's my firm belief that if your basal insulin's not right, that nothing else is going to work. That anything you're seeing is I kind of think of them as a ghost. I like when I get a hold of somebody privately and they get on the phone and they say, well, here's what happens. And they start telling me these specific stories about it. At lunchtime, this happens and she gets high and then it goes over here. And I'm like, no, stop. You don't have enough basal insulin. And I said, until the basal's right, how do you know that you're not bolusing for food and that the insulin you think is going towards the food is actually going towards your basal deficit? So let's get your basal right first. Apparently my daughter does not have a signal to her Dexcom anymore. And I find that people are very resistant to that idea, especially if they have lows. So when they hear more insulin and they hear pre-bolus, but they see lows, they just think, no, that those two things don't seem like they fit together. But it's everything, because obviously if you have enough basal insulin, then you use less meal insulin. Less meal insulin causes fewer lows. I'm thrilled that I said fewer because I think that's grammatically correct. And that is the basis of it to me. It's more basal. If you're not using enough, you have to pre-bolus. And then after that, in my opinion, it's about understanding the glycemic load and index of the food you're eating. If you have those three basic concepts down, you're more than half of the way there. And most of the time, people need more insulin. I am always and endlessly fascinated with people who are like, look, my blood sugar is 300. What do you think's wrong? I think you don't have enough insulin. My blood sugar is 40. What do I think's wrong? I think you have too much insulin. It's fascinating how the common sense of it seems to go away because there's so much fear. And a lot of that fear, I believe, comes from having these experiences, these outcomes that aren't real, but you're following your doctor's advice and it's what's happening. So you just think, well, this must be what diabetes is. And then I talk to people about bumping and nudging insulin, which is something that I think is fascinating. When Arden started using loop, I was like, oh my God, the loop is bumping and nudging and stopping the arrows. I don't let arrows dictate what happens next. If I see a straight up arrow, I stop it. So I'll probably be mentioning these things over the next 20 minutes or so while I'm jumping through this stuff. So I usually show this. If you see in the top left here, Emmett Kate was a little girl whose mom sent me that graph. And I went over no more or no less than what's in this presentation. And then the next day she sent me the graph below it. And I got this note, and I like to have this one up here because she actually says that she got to stop thinking about diabetes. And to me, that's such a big deal. I think that what I'm going to talk about seems like a ton of work, and it really isn't. It becomes so second nature that it just kind of happens. So I think everything about diabetes is understanding how insulin works. I think that most of people's issues are that they just don't know what insulin does or how it does it. They think of it as a light switch. They put the insulin in, they push the button, they push the plunger, the insulin's there, that's it. They don't think about the timing, the impact, and that all becomes incredibly important when you're looping, in my opinion. Of course, don't be scared of insulin, but this is a good time for me to jump in, even though Joanne said it, to say that I am just a person. I am not an entity or a company. And should I say something here tonight that leads to the demise of you or a loved one, I got nothing to do with it, okay? I misspoke or whatever, or you misunderstood. Not advice, right? So I like to talk about the acceptance thing that happens, is that, at some point you're newly diagnosed and a doctor gives you a range, right? And there's a good reason they give you this range. Like, over under 200 is fine. That's usually the number, right? Under 200 is fine. But then I think what happens to people is that they hit 200 and they still feel like they're in range. Then they get to 210 and 210 only seems like it's 10 higher than 200. And then, 220 and 240. And then before you know it, that seems normal. And I think that people stop considering that a person without diabetes, blood sugar might be 85 and go up to maybe no more than 130 if they really tax their system. So when you're 230, you're 140 points higher than what somebody has when they don't have type 1 diabetes. And to me, that just seems sad if it's not, because it's not necessary. I think if you just put in the right amount of insulin at the right time, you end up with a reasonable blood sugar most of the time. And so how does this happen to people? Most of them say they're scared to be low. It's incredibly understandable, and I would never minimize that fear. But in my opinion, and the way I manage my daughter's blood sugar every day is I get up every morning and I think consciously, I would rather stop a low or falling blood sugar than fight with a high one. That is a clarion thought in my head. The minute I err on the side of caution, things tend to go wrong. Timing and amount. If I was falling out of an airplane to my death and you yelled up, Scott, what do you need people to know about type 1 diabetes? You only have 5 seconds. I'd say it's about using the right amount of insulin at the right time. If you gave me 10 more seconds, I'd tell you, and get your basal straight, and you have to pre-bolus. And for the love of God, understand the difference between 10 carbs of potatoes and 10 carbs of apples, that they're different. I think that those few ideas are absolutely the core. We talked about basal insulin. Doesn't matter if you're MDI or pump, it has to be in the right place. I know nobody here is MDI, but I just had a conversation with somebody the other day where they said, every night, in these 4 hours, my kid's always high. And I was like, why don't you split the basal and put some more during the day than you do overnight? And then, it was like I said, we should all fly to Mars together. She was just stunned by the concept that could do it. I'm going to take a second to talk about, if you don't mind. I think of bolusing a meal like a tug of war between insulin and food, or food and your and body function, right? And for anyone listening, because I think looping is amazing, I want to say for sure. I think all these algorithms are going to be life-changing for people, but you still are going to have to understand diabetes at its core to get through it, to make sense, and to be able to manipulate it when it doesn't go 100% the way you want. So the way I explain to people is, if you put insulin over here and carbs over here, and you ask them to pull at the same time, with this idea of there's a flag, hanging from the middle of your rope, and winning is getting your flag to the other side in a regular tug of war. But in diabetes, winning is the flag not moving, right? When you see a straight line on someone's graph, that's the flag not moving. But so many people put their insulin in and start to eat. And then, of course, the food begins to win that tug of war. And it could go 20 or 30 minutes before the insulin even comes online. And then it begins to pull slowly, but by then the food's really cruising. So even if you start at this 90 blood sugar, now you're over here, 200 diagonal up, the food's gaining momentum. So the number's growing, there's momentum happening, and all you have over here is the insulin you meant for the carbs. The carbs, that you counted when you started, that hopefully you were right about and probably you weren't right about. So now all this momentum and this number's happening, and all of a sudden this insulin comes online. This insulin is lost. It can't do anything. And people don't understand that as they see these diagonal arrows go up and finally level off, it's a leveling where this insulin finally comes at full power. And it's got you now 250, and it's holding it. It stops the rise, but it can't get you down, and it's not going to. Not if you did a reasonable pre-bolus with not enough insulin. But what if you did a bad pre-bolus with the right amount of insulin? Still doesn't work. It's got to be the right amount at the right time. You have to create this fight right here. You have to put the insulin in, because the insulin pulls super slow. And it's slow, and some people 15 minutes it starts to pick up, some people's 20 minutes. Some people don't think of the difference between bolusing a meal at a 180 and bolusing a meal at 80. They don't see the difference in that. If my daughter was 180, I'd put in carbs and a correction. I'd have her blood sugar 100 and falling when she started to eat. Most people don't do that. Most people put in 180. They don't, even if they pre-bolus, what do they get to? 150, and they start eating, maybe if they're lucky. And then all of a sudden the food starts to win. You start at 150, you end up at 250, right? At least if you started at 180, at 85, you might get to 185. But it's a fight that's unfair. And so to make it fair, you just got to let the insulin cheat and go first. And I used to think that saying that was a waste of time, but every day someone contacts me to say that their life has been changed because they didn't understand the timing of insulin. So I don't like to not go over it. And you're going to see how I do it with looping in just a minute. This is incredibly important. All carbs are not created equal. You cannot confuse carb counting with understanding the impact of carbs. Glycemic load and glycemic index are, like, to me, the most boring words I think I've ever heard in an office. And yet I wish I could go back to that moment and pay attention when they were trying to explain the difference to me by how carbs impact people. You really can't expect, I think that the people don't understand generally that your doctor gives you a ratio and it's a starting point. It's not a rule. And so somebody will count, oh, this is 20 carbs, and they'll put their insulin in, it works great. And then the next day they have 20 carbs of something that's more complex and it doesn't work. And then they just think, I don't know what they think. They think the diabetes fairy came along and touched them on the head and ruined everything. I don't know what they think, but they don't understand the difference between the impact that carbs have. And it's incredibly important, especially I find in looping when you need to set up different absorption times. To add on to that, I'm not much of a carb counter. And that was very difficult when we started to loop. I look at a plate, I think, that looks like 7 units. That looks like 7.5 units. That looks like 8 units, but I want to put 4 in now and have the other 4 go in over an hour. That's how my brain works when I look at food. And I know that, but I know now that carb counting is incredibly important to looping. And I'll tell you in a second how I got past that. This, I think, is incredibly important. You have to trust that what you know is going to happen will happen, because so many good decisions are right there in front of you when you're managing your insulin, and fear stops you. I was talking to someone the other night whose child experiences a lot of lows in the late evenings. And I helped her change all of her settings. And then we got everything good. And there was this one night and her blood sugar was 93. And she says, my daughter wants a snack. And I said, oh, okay. You're going to bolus, right? She goes, no, I'm afraid she'll get low. And I said, she's not going to get low because the carbs are going to make her blood sugar go up. All this bolusing that you used to do every night to stop these highs from these, she was just stacking insulin, which is odd for me to say because I think it's not stacking if you need it, but it is stacking when you don't need it. So she'd mistime her meal. The kid would shoot up. The whole time the kid's shooting up, she's layering in a unit. The kid comes in, the kid comes crashing down. And that's what she was accustomed to. But of course, we fixed her basal. We changed her pre-bolus time. We fixed her ratio for her meals. And she had a nice little thing like this. And she's 93 now. And all that work, days of work, went into that happening. Okay. And then what was the first thing she wanted to do when she had it right? The first thing she wanted to do was revert back to her fear and not bolus for this food. And of course, eventually the kid's blood sugar ended up at like 175. And because carbs impact blood sugar. If you're eating carbs and your blood sugar is not going up, you have made a mistake in the past with insulin. I think it is incredibly important for people to understand that what you do right now with insulin in this moment is for later. But more importantly, what happened before is what's happening now. And even though those are the same thing said 2 different ways, it's more important to understand it like that. What you did prior is what's happening now. It's always what you're doing now is for later. So, and this to me is, this is paramount in my opinion. I think that too often people look at diabetes and they're just like that story I just told you. They're in a defensive mode. They're covered up and they don't want to get hit. They're just trying to survive. But I am a huge fan of hitting first. I like going first. If anybody's ever been in a fist fight, and I don't know if anybody here would like to admit to that or not, but Glenn, you ever hit a man? Or one of the Lawsons has, sir, right? Yeah. Do you like to hit people? Like, what's the best play in a fist fight? You hit first or you wait to get hit?
Oh, you got to hit first.
You got to hit first, right? You have to. Because, and this is going to be a baseballism, and I feel bad using a baseball, I cannot get my mouse to work, just so you know. I don't know what's happening. I hate to use it. There it is. I'm back in the game. I hate to use a sports metaphor, because I don't think everybody always gets them. But there's a common idea in sports that you dictate the pace, okay? It's incredibly important to dictate the pace. Don't let the game happen to you. You happen to the game. You might lose sometimes, but at least you'll know I did this and then this happened. There's cause and effect. And so when you do that with blood sugar, I want you to pre-bolus, because if you get low, at least you know I did this and I got low. So next time, maybe I'll do it a little shorter, or maybe a little less insulin, a little more, a little less, a little sooner, a little later. But at least I did it, and then that happened. When you wait for diabetes to happen, you're stuck going through a million possibilities in your head, and you are absolutely going to choose the wrong one when you're trying to figure out what happened. There are just too many variables. You're never going to figure it out. So act first. Don't put yourself on the defense. Because if you chase insulin, you are going to get on that roller coaster, right? You're going to be chasing blood sugars all around. You're going to be bolusing at the wrong times. You're going to be, this poor loop is going to be cutting things off at the wrong times. Everyone who's on loop has made a big bolus for food. Watch the basal get taken away while your blood sugar is creeping up, right? And you're like, why is this happening? Why won't it just put the basal back on? And why would it go up? It's so certain it doesn't need the basal. You use the wrong amount of insulin. If you put the right amount of insulin in that situation, it backwards manages the insulin, right? You throw it all in, it takes the basal away, and then it brings the basal back in as you need. The problem with loop is it trusts you, which I guess makes that the problem with you, and your ability to count carbs, understand the impact of foods, and understand what you need to tell that algorithm so that it can do what it needs to do. All right. Don't stare at high blood sugars, please. And with loop, I don't know if this is controversial or not. You'll excuse me if it is. I am not one of those people who wants to watch loop bring down a 200 over 6 hours. I'm not good at that. I see a high blood sugar, I open the loop, I crush the blood sugar, I figure out when to reclose the loop so it can catch it, and I get back in the game. People outside of loop, I tell them all the time, crush, get level, start over. Start over means get active insulin out of your system. But that's the only way to get off the roller coaster. If you wait, you're going to run into another meal, and then it's going to start over again. So for me, for my money, with loop, it's open, crush, level, start over. It's the only way to stop the roller coaster as far as I've ever been able to figure out. Some people, Kenny will probably tell you there's a way to bolus hard and keep the loop active. I'm not always good at that. This is for my other things that it has nothing to do with this, but it's worth saying here as we go by. When your doctor says no, ask why, because sometimes they say no because they're uncomfortable or they don't understand or they don't want to look like they don't know. I'm not saying ignore your doctor. I'm saying make them explain it to you, because sometimes they just don't have a good reason. So some other charts of people that I've helped in the past that are one day to the next. I put them in here not to show how amazing I am, but to tell you if you're struggling, it's totally possible. The difference between these charts, one to the next, is nothing more or nothing less than settings in the right place and understanding how insulin works. So it's so funny that I use this. You realize all that most people don't loop, right? So when I speak in public, I use this graph to explain how I managed my daughter through a really high carb meal. And this is all manual, but it struck me one day as I was standing in front of a group, I turned back and looked at it and I thought, oh, looks like Night Scout, right? It's where the, where the temp basals come in and shut down, or where the bumping comes in with a little more auto boluses if you're using the auto bolus mode, or an increase in the basal. It really stunned me. I was in Atlanta and I looked up at it. And it was the first time I had the thought. I was like, this was me acting like an algorithm. And I am so thrilled not to have to do it anymore. I can't begin to tell you. I'm still happy to explain it to people, and I can explain it in my sleep. But all of those decisions that I made that morning, for the most part, I watched the loop make. This is an overview, which we don't need. This is how you follow me on the gram and the Facebook, right? I'm not trying to steal from Joanne, but I have a private Facebook group that some people say is pretty good. So some really helpful people in there. I think it's up to like 5,500 people or something like that. And it makes me really proud to watch people talk about the things that, this is going to sound self-serving, but it's really weird to see people explain diabetes to others the way I explained it to them. It's very fulfilling. And they're really good at it. There's plenty of times where I think, I can't tell these people, but they're way better at this than I am. If you want to listen to the podcast, it's everywhere. Those are some quick start episodes that people say bring you into kind of my way of thinking about diabetes. I'm sure that you can get them out of the video by pausing it. And then we have a pro tip series, which is, I'm sorry, I would totally shut that off if I knew where my phone was. It's a pro tip series with me and Jenny Smith. Some of you might know Jenny. She's a CDE who's had diabetes for like 32 years now. She works at Integrated Diabetes, but she's a friend of mine. So it's not an advertisement for Integrated. She comes on and she helps me break down my ideas, because the one thing you may be getting by now is that I'm kind of chatty and not good at speaking to a topic. So I realized that I kind of brought up these ideas and that I should drill down on them. And Jenny came on to be the person who kind of keeps me focused while we're talking. Jenny and I also do an Ask Scott and Jenny episode once in a while where people send in questions and we answer them. And Defining Diabetes are short episodes where we just define terms, which again was one of those things I couldn't imagine anyone needed, but I get a note once a week from someone who says, I didn't realize I was doing MDI. Wow, there's music. I don't remember that. You probably can't hear this. Hold on, we're gonna get rid of this. All right. So I'm doing all this. Let me try to unshare my screen. Hi. So that's how I'm managing my daughter for years, right? Her A1C has been between 5.2 and 6.2 for 6.5 years now. And one day, I don't know, a year or so ago, I got a message from someone who said that they learned how to manage diabetes from me, but they were going to do loop. And they wanted me to do loop so I could explain loop to them. And I thought, but I'm so good at this, and this is so easy for us. I don't want to learn a new thing. But then I really thought about it, and I realized I want people to move to algorithms. I believe they're going to, and I do want to be able to talk about them with them. So I said to my daughter, we're gonna move you to this loop thing. Now, full disclosure, my daughter hates the Riley link with a burning passion. She hates having to be aware of it. She hates being near it. She hates everything about it. It's been a year now, and she'll still tell me she hates it every once in a while. It's not the thing itself, obviously. It's amazing, the thing itself. But the concept of having to keep it around her, she despises it. But I bring it to her, and I explain this whole thing, and we set it up one day and put it on her. And the last thing she said to me before we put it on is, this thing going to kill me? And I looked at her and I went, I don't think so. And then we laughed and walked away from each other. And it has not killed her. It's actually been absolutely amazing. But here are some of the pitfalls we found when we started. I have no idea what my daughter's insulin to carb ratio is. I don't count carbs. The last time that we put a correction ratio in her PDM for her Omnipod, it was 1 unit moves her 300 points. And as you can imagine, she's 16. 1 unit does not move her 300 points anymore. But the point is that we did not pay attention to any of that stuff. We looked at food and bolused. If I taught myself how to stop rises with temp basals, how to stop falls with temp basals, I'd make little bumps of insulin. I had no idea what her basal insulin even should be. It didn't matter because we were on a rolling 24-hour clock with diabetes. So it turned out that the basal that we had set in her pump was far too low for her, but we didn't realize it because of how aggressively we bolused and how we were bumping and nudging all the time, which I think is an amazing way to understand how much insulin you need. But what I understand now that I didn't understand then is if you find yourself bumping blood sugars down a lot with more insulin, you should probably add that insulin into your basal or your bolus wherever it's appropriate. So anyway, her numbers are so far out of whack. I can't make this thing work, right? Like I set it up And God bless all of you that can read those documents and make sense of them. I'm not that person. I don't understand, the thing on Night Scout where you slide your finger to see different times. I don't know how to do that. Every time I try to touch it, it makes me upset and I leave it alone. I hit refresh because I can't get it back. I can build the app now, but let's be honest, I don't know what I'm doing. So I didn't understand any of those settings in Loop, none of them. And I turned to Jenny because Jenny trains people on things and she, had been using Loop herself. And it's the first thing we realized that Arden's basal was at something like 0.5 and needed to be like 1.3 or something like that. And so you can imagine I was never going to make it from 0.5 to 1.3. I never could have imagined that. But Jenny sat me down and she said, how often do you bump Arden's blood sugar? And so I didn't know. So I paid attention. We opened the Loop back up so I could do it again manually. We paid attention. And there were units and units of insulin that I didn't realize we were using. So we started getting them back into the basal. It started to work. But then that insulin sensitivity, I got to tell you, for like 6 months, I just sat in this room and mumbled to myself and cursed. Like, I get the mathematical reason why a negative number is stronger than a positive number. But oh my God, like when you're trying to think the whole thing through, I just want it to be more, you know what I mean? And more should be greater. And so I would get stuck on that. And then I'd move a setting and it didn't work. And it was a mess. It was an absolute mess. And there are 3 times that I can think of that had I not said out loud on the podcast, I'm going to try to Loop, I would have stopped doing it. And I think that's important for everyone to hear when you're talking about it with other people, because now I'm thrilled that we're doing it. And I'm very glad we didn't quit. So if it's you who's having that feeling right now, or if you've spoken to somebody who's saying it's not worth it, you got to get them past it somehow. But then the part that those people don't have, that this group is wonderful for, is that I could go to people and ask for help, like people way smarter than me who understood it better, who said, like, let's make your sensitivity this or that. I don't know how the best way is to train people to use Loop, but it's an incredibly important thing because I think most people will try it if they don't have someone to ask. I can't imagine how they wouldn't give up at some point. So all the things that everyone does around this are so meaningful, because I talk to people constantly on the podcast who are living in A1Cs in the 8s or 9s or 10s, and you slap the Loop on them that was even halfway calibrated correctly, you change their life. You would absolutely change their life. And I think that's thrilling. So I'm always sort of in the background hoping that I can learn more about Loop so that I can help other people do it, or other algorithms. I'm happy to talk about, I want to learn about Control IQ, and not that Medtronic, no, but Medtronic too. And hopefully when Omnipod 5 comes out, I'd like to be able to understand that as well, because this is how it should be done. It's absolutely marvelous. I'm not, some places where we still miss, and Kenny tries to tell me sometimes that it's not aggressive enough, is that my daughter eats a lot of high carb stuff sometimes. And it's a leap in your head to give somebody 20 units of insulin when you know that meal really in the past didn't need that much. But I'm getting better at that idea. When
A
my
lot of
daughter,
that was from your basal changing, right? Like you've lowered it a little bit less and given more meals. So that's a big transition.
Yeah. So what happened was that when COVID happened and Arden came home from school, it was fascinating actually. Arden's basal while she was in high school was up to like, it might have been 2 units an hour, and she weighs like 130 pounds. And then boom, COVID happened. She gets home, she relaxes over a couple of days, and all of whatever life is, at high school was gone. And she was crashing constantly, like really badly. Constantly, we were feeding her insulin. And finally one day I just thought, like, I don't know what's happening, but this isn't stopping. And I sent Kenny a note, and I was like, or you might have messaged me, and I was in the middle of this idea. I'm like, I'm just going to start over. And Kenny was like, try to go to 1 let's just go to one basal and see what happens. And her basals weren't like crazy. She had like 2. She had an overnight and, a during the day one, but they were really high. So now Arden's basal rates are, same girl, 0.9 an hour during the day and 0.7 overnight, maybe, something like that. Her insulin sensitivity is in the mid 40s, but before that, it was in the high 50s. So I didn't meaningfully understand any of that. And even sitting here right now in front of you, I don't know if I meaningfully understand it. But I have to be honest with you. I do know how to adjust out of it now. And because Arden is older, Arden is basically 3 different diabetics every month. So she's the diabetic she is the week she's having her period. The week after she has her period is easy. The loop will keep Arden at 85 the week after her period like it's nothing. And then there's that 3rd week. I don't know what to call that because it's not quite premenstrual, but things start to change there. And then the week before, things change again. But all I do is make her sensitivity a little stronger. And then once she's in the real tough part of it, I bump her basal up a tiny bit. And then as soon as I see that be too strong and she's coming out of it, I move it back down again. I do say to my 16-year-old daughter too often, is your period over? Or are you about to get your period? But it's just incredibly important to understand. I have not noticed that her meals are that much different, the ratios for her meals. But then again, I still don't count carbs. So I guess we should talk about that. In the beginning of Loop, I was panicked because I had not counted carbs in a really long time. I would just estimate the plate. And I was like, oh my God, am I going to have to count carbs? My whole podcast exists because I didn't want to count carbs. Like everything I learned how to do was to not count carbs. And now someone's telling me this Loop thing is great, but you got to count carbs. And I was like, I'm not doing that. So I just kept doing the reverse math in my head. I'd look at the plate and think, this is 9 units of insulin. And then I would, pick a random insulin to carb ratio, try it, and then I kept moving it until the ratio fit my guess math. I think that's really important if you're looping, because I don't understand how to count carbs well. I mean, I can count them, don't get me wrong, but I am not going to teach my daughter to weigh food her entire life. The Loop's actually kind of great about that, because I used to be overly aggressive when I wasn't sure, and then we would just take basal away, and now I can be overly aggressive and the Loop can take the basal away. And it works great. But I don't know if I explained that right. Kenny, you can stop me if I didn't, but I don't know what Arden's insulin to carb ratio is. I still don't know. We guess the plate. And then I've learned to look at the plate and think, okay, that's 7 units. And then I made up a ratio that tells me that's 50 carbs. Then after that, we'll split them sometimes. 30 carbs over 3 hours, the other 20 over 4, if it's more high carb meal. If it's something that I see a lot of, something just popped up in my, oh, look at it. You guys have little things where people can make polls. This is very fancy.
I just put that up, Scott, because
I would never know how to do something like that. That's amazing. And by the way, I know it's not amazing. It's just when it popped up, I was like, people are great. So in my opinion, whether you're looping or you're doing it the way I used to do it, to me, it's more insulin. Be aggressive. I always want to be on the aggressive side of it. I tell a story on the podcast when people don't understand about adrenaline, right? How adrenaline can pop your blood sugar up out of nowhere, and then the adrenaline goes away and it crashes through the floor again, but it's still real. So my daughter used to play basketball, and we'd show up and her blood sugar would be amazing, and she'd start playing and it would just fly up. And so after a couple of weeks, I said to my wife, I can't let her run around here 270 playing this basketball game. We have to bolus for this adrenaline, right? But it wouldn't happen every time. So it took me a while to figure out that my daughter was really competitive. And if she showed up to a game and saw another team that looked like a bunch of killers, like you'd really have to fight with them, she'd get kind of jacked up. But if she saw a bunch of powder puffs over there, she's like, oh, we're going to beat these girls, no problem. And so she would either get it or not get it. I did not know how to infer how she was feeling. So I told my wife, I'm going to bolus a juice box. Like, I'm going to take this juice box that we think of as medicine. I'm going to think about it as food. I'm going to make a bolus for this juice box. And that insulin should be enough to stop the adrenaline. And if she shouldn't get the adrenaline jump, we'll just give her the juice box. We'll just consider that we pre-bolus the juice box and give it to her. I know a lot of people would not bolus before a basketball game when their kid may or may not have a jump in insulin, but I couldn't sit there and watch it happen. So I was like, let me just do something that seems reasonable. I'll bolus for a juice box. And so I still use that idea today when I'm trying to be aggressive with, carbier foods, which I know is not a word, but I prefer to say. I just bolus extra, because I found that I kept saying to people, more insulin, and they'd say, how much more? It's the bane of my existence. Everybody wants a number or a time, I don't know the number. I always tell them, like, figure it out, like, try it. But they couldn't make that leap. And I realized that they hadn't been through my journey. They didn't write for 6 months about not being afraid and like badger themselves through it and have this experience of writing on this blog for a decade. And so how do we do it? And I just still tell them, I'm like, I'd over bolus this meal, the equivalent of a juice box. And if it goes wrong, have some of the juice. Don't do it for the rest of your life, right? But it's a good way to try. And I think you can be more. All right, listen, I'm going to figure it. Hold on one second. I'm following a number of people on Dexcom. It is my daughter.
It's Arden. She's an hour without readings.
Yeah, all right.
But she bolused and stuff recently. So
I just got a note. CGM expired. Arden doesn't want to do it by herself. So we're testing. And we're going to test until, okay. She wears her CGM at a place that she can't get to. And she
Scott, I have a question for you about Arden.
I have nothing but answers.
So I have a quick question about Arden. First of all, she's 16. Is she driving yet?
Yes.
Good for you. Does that make you nervous?
No, she's a really good driver.
Okay. She sounds like she has a similar personality to yours, kind of bold.
Probably. Yeah, the first time after she got her permit, I put her on I-95 and I made her drive to another state. and she said, she goes, I'm not allowed to drive out of state. I was like, that's only if they catch you. And so we got in the car, and in about 20 minutes, she's like, Dad, we're going 70 miles an hour. I was like, I know. Should speed up. People are coming up behind us pretty quickly. And she did it. She drove for a half an hour on 95, and we got off an exit, and then we headed back in the other direction. So yeah, she's got an aggressive personality, I would say.
So as a 16-year-old, is she beginning to manage most of her boluses and her assumption of what a meal would need, or are you still doing a majority of that?
Well, I can give you an example of just this morning. We left the house. My wife and I went to my son's in college, and he's playing in a fall collegiate league, and we went to see him play today. And Arden had a sleepover with friends. And a couple girls were here, and they were still asleep. And they woke up. They made pancakes from scratch, and she bolused for them. She didn't do a great job at it, but she didn't think twice about it. And as soon as she saw her blood sugar go up, she gave herself more insulin. And I do think I would like to touch on this for a second. There's a lot of good research that says that children can benefit greatly from having help with their type 1 diabetes into their mid-20s even. And so I stop and think about all the things in the world I'd put a 5-year-old in charge of, or an 8-year-old in charge of, or a 16-year-old, and my list is not very long. And I think it's interesting that people want their kids to be able to do this incredibly complex thing when they're 13. I get that they're going to need to be able to do it at some point. So the way I manage diabetes is the way I think of parenting. That would be that we do things over and over again. It's my job to say things a million times until one day I don't need to say them anymore. It's my job not to look irritated by that, or, I do my best. And one day you just understand it. And the way I think of it is every year my kids start school, and they go into a math class and they come home, and inevitably in the first week they tell me, this math teacher sucks. They don't know what they're doing. I'm never going to learn this. And then at the end of the year, they understand the math. And I always ask at the end of the year, because I'm trying to make a point, as I say, do you remember learning all this? And they're like, no. And I'm like, no, but you learned it. It happened, right? So that's, to me, is diabetes. It's a slow handoff of ideas. Because what I would tell you if you called me, privately, if you sent me a message, I would tell you that diabetes is a series of experiences that are mostly going to go wrong until they start going right. And you actually have to have the experience, and you have to have it go wrong, because that's the only way you learn. When it just works, you don't know why it works. You know what I mean? Like when things just work, you're just like, it works. Like, I don't know why my TV works. It comes on every time. The minute it's broken, I'm screwed because I don't know how my TV works. But if every fourth time I turned that TV on, it didn't come on, I'd have learned how to fix it by now. And I think that about diabetes. So is my daughter better at managing her blood sugar today than she was last week? She is. She's way better at it than she was a month ago. And she's going to leave for college in a couple of years if COVID, if you guys all wear your masks and get inoculated and stuff like that. And I'm going to send her off to school, and she's going to be okay. And then things are going to go wrong there, and we're going to do it. And one day I just feel like I won't hear from her, and that'll be it. But I don't have a timetable on it. I don't want her to have to understand it. The amount of things I understand about diabetes is staggering, and there is no meaningful way to put it into her head. And I don't accept that her A1C needs to be 9 while she's figuring it out. So that's how I think about that.
Can we talk for a moment about endocrinologists or medical healthcare professionals, other than say no? Do you think they're too frightened when they talk about treatment? You say be bold. I don't hear that very often out of the medical professionals. And as teenagers are aging into becoming young adults, is it the parents' responsibility the most to help them get independent, or do you think that's a team effort?
Well, listen, I think that diabetes is incredibly complicated, and that doctors, even some endocrinologists, don't meaningfully understand it. I also don't think it's reasonable to have them meaningfully understand it. Most of them don't live with it. And even if they do live with it, there's this idea, right, that like a doctor can't, listen, you can't go into your doctor's appointment. The doctor can't go, nothing you hear in this doctor's appointment should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Please consult somebody else besides me. And now I'm going to explain pre-bolusing to you, because they're stuck not knowing you, right? Every person in front of them could be brilliant or could be an idiot or somewhere in between, and they don't know who's who. And by the way, I know some brilliant people who can't figure out how to pre-bolus to save their lives. As a matter of fact, many intelligent people who understand the mathematics of things want diabetes to be mathematical, and I don't believe it is at all, honestly. I think it's so much of the art of it and the understanding. I don't think that when I tell people understand the glycemic index and the glycemic load, that doesn't mean that every time they eat, they should like open up the internet and go, okay, so we got this with the glycemic index of 60, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at that plate and going, that part's going to hit fast, that part's going to hit long, and that part's not going to do anything. That's what they need to do. And they'd be able to do that on the fly. And I don't know how a doctor could explain that to you. The podcast is popular because it's conversational and at your own pace. And because I say what I think, and then other people come on and say what they think. And sometimes people say things and I'm like, man, that's amazing. I never would have thought of it that way. I don't say it out loud, but they get to hear it. That builds to me in the same way that I'm trying to build on art. I think of the people who are listening as people who I am slowly trying to get to a place. I feel like that's my job. I don't think doctors can do that. I don't think they have the time to do it. If you knew how many doctors, I get notes all the time from doctors who say, I could never admit this out loud, but you're part of what I tell people to do. Or the practitioners in the room who aren't the doctors, who wait for the doctor to leave and grab people and go, Juicebox Podcast, find a podcast app, listen to this. That's because they know they can't either. And you can't evaluate people, and you also can't say everything you need to say and then send them on their way. Because if they misunderstand one part of it, they're screwed and you're gone. I've got it down to a brisk 45 minutes. I jumped through it in a couple of minutes for you, but I would have gone into a number of stories that would have left you an hour later with a lower A1C. There are people who come to my live talks and have an A1C in the sixes right away. There are also people who come to them and they're completely frustrated by what I said. I think that the difference there is that I want everyone to hear it, understanding that not everyone's going to get it. And I think doctors want no one to hear it because they're afraid some of them aren't going to understand it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and they also have to realize that we know more than they do.
At some point you will.
Yeah.
And the worst part of that really, Joanne, is the part where when you start seeing it but don't understand it. Like, I find one of the most frustrating things about being alive, like I like to think to the end of my understanding and then wonder what's beyond it. It's a thinking exercise that I do. There are plenty of things I don't understand, but you can't imagine something you don't know. Like, it doesn't exist, right? Like, I could sit here in front of you right now. I can 100% tell you I'm a fairly bright person. I failed out of algebra. I do not understand algebra, even the simplest algebra. And if you put a problem in front of me right now, I could not imagine what's beyond it. I just can't. And so this is what ends up happening to people, is that they start seeing listen, just for context, and not because I want you to go listen to the podcast if you don't listen to it. That podcast has 2.25 million downloads. A year from now, it's going to have 3.5 million downloads. It is downloaded crazy. People listen straight through it. People binge 400 episodes of the podcast. And as they're doing it, their A1Cs drop down, right? So I'm pretty happy, and it's tried and true, I think, what's in there. But they can't. But if I tried to tell those people, on day 5, now do it right, they can't. But then they start seeing that it's wrong, right? The doctor said this, but now this is happening. And that's wrong. But then we get white coated, right? Like most people are raised, what is it? It's cops, teachers, and doctors, right? Those are the 3 people you don't question. Cops, teachers, and doctors. So the amount of notes that I get on a daily basis from people are like, I don't understand what's going on. I feel like I should do this pre-bolusing, but the doctor didn't say for me to. And so that's enough to stop most people. That's it. And so there are so many people living with type 1 diabetes right now who see that something's wrong, but can't get past it. And so sometimes I think the podcast is just a pat on the ass. It's just a little like, go ahead, try it. The only advice I'll ever give somebody, and I'll call it advice, is you should trust your gut. You should use your common sense.
Okay, so there was a question from Tim who said, how do you get over your fear of knowing that what you're doing works, even if the A1C is under 6, and of making the changes? How do you get over that angst or anxiety?
How do you get over the angst or anxiety? Say it to me one more time. What's the question?
How do you get over your fear of knowing that what you're doing is right? You're making some bold decisions.
But you're still afraid of it? Repetition, Joanne. You just got to keep going until one day you're not afraid of it anymore. I was afraid of my wife for like 15 years, but I'm not anymore.
Well, you should be.
Oh, I am. Don't worry. I made that up. I'm really afraid of her. But everything else, I'm not afraid of her. I think that at some point, you do something and it happens. And you do it again and it happens. And then you're back to my slide that you have to trust that what you know is going to happen is going to happen. And that works 2 ways. It cuts twice. It means you have to pre-bolus. There's no world where you don't have to pre-bolus, except for the time where you screwed something up in the past and didn't realize it and pre-bolused and got low. But you can't let one low a month make you want to be high 29 other days, right? Go ahead.
I think Tim's question also includes, like, how did you get from the fear of knowing that what you're doing was working before loop to looping? Like, you talked a little bit about trying to jump in and just tackle this loop thing. I guess maybe his question is there any tips you'd give him for transitioning, or what kept you going?
I said out loud to about 40,000 people that I was doing it. I felt like I couldn't stop.
There you go. So you got to tell the world and then not give up, huh?
Yeah, go tell a bunch of people you're going to do it, and then that'll keep you doing it. But no, Tim, I think the real answer is that once you figure it out, it's amazing. This is the future. This is how it's going to be. Tim, I'll tell you what, I'm going to tell you a story that's going to be a bit of a downer, but I think it'll help you through this transition. When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I am almost 50. I know I look amazing, right, for almost being 50. You're all thinking it. Just go ahead and nod so that I feel good about that. I'm
amazing.
Sarah, please, Sarah, I can see you. Nod. I don't look 50, right? Come on, Sarah. Yeah, see? All right, now. So my buddy Mike's diagnosed when we're 19. Back then, he got this big meter that he couldn't take out of his house. And what he was told was get up in the morning, decide if you're going to be active or not, give yourself some RNN and, do it another time. And as we grew up, Mike was always the kid who was dizzy, who you didn't want to drive all the time. He'd say some weird stuff once in a while and you'd realize he needed food. And then the world kept changing and Mike didn't change with it. He never updated the way he managed his diabetes. And last year I went to Mike's funeral. So he had a heart attack and he died because he was trying to manage type 1 diabetes in 2019 like it was 2000, like it was 30 years before. He was a really great guy and completely healthy other than that. And he was ordering dinner one night and he had a heart attack and that was the end. So
that's a great transition for me to ask you my next question. And I'm really sorry for the loss. And
No. Joanne, before you get to the question, my greater point to Tim is this stuff is getting better and better and better and better. And I'm telling you that 20 years from now, you do not want to look back and think, oh, I'm still doing it the way people did it 20 years ago. This is better. And so if you can't not be afraid, just know it's the right thing to do.
Well, and then connect to the community because you can get the feedback you need. My question is the new technology, the branches on loop or the new insulins. How do you view those? Or are you jumping in?
Oh yeah, we use the auto bolus. I didn't particularly like loop before the auto bolus, to be perfectly honest with you, because it wasn't fast enough for me, because basal changes weren't fast enough. Back when I bumped and nudged, or I was temp basing, I would do it all. I'd temp basal up, and then I'd bolus on top of it. I think of carb heavy meals as time frames, and I like to lay a heavy blanket of basal insulin over that need. I think that too many of us are like, oh, my basal's 0.9. That always works. Yeah, that works when you're sleeping or when you're watching television. It doesn't work when you ate a half a pizza. Like, that's not the same anymore. A healthy body would ramp up insulin production significantly over eating like that. So I like to lay a heavy blanket. So when it went to auto bolus, I went right with it. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty close to saying I wish it did more than 40%.
Have you thought of the free APS branch?
Oh, Joanne, I don't understand what you're saying.
It's an event for Scott to do builds. We've talked about that before. I can help him change it from 40 to 50 to 60. I have Tessa on 70% right now.
I don't know how to move the time thing on the Night Scout. I told you this earlier. I don't know what you're talking about. And I am in the enviable position of not having to understand it, because at some point someone will want me to know for the podcast and they'll help me. So
yeah, Scott and I have a Zoom session to get to at some point, huh?
Yeah, 100%, right? So the loop infrequently makes Arden low, very infrequently. But it's enough that makes me comfortable thinking that percentage could be higher. So, but I'm always for better. I mean, and I'm thinking about Tim now, who's scared. Like, I don't want him to let go of it. And it just, this is going to sound trite, but this is the absolute best time in the history of the world to have type 1 diabetes right now. But you got to keep in mind that when I was 19, that was absolutely the best time to have type 1 diabetes in the history of the world. That day that my buddy was diagnosed, that was the best day for it right then. So I'm saying, you got to stay on the train, because I don't know what's coming in the future, but I want to know what it is when it happens, because this is just, it's amazing. I'm sorry. Do you have other questions?
We did have the poll we popped up was how do you manage carbs? Because you were talking about how you don't count carbs. And we had two answers, close to accurate and best guess. And we had only 64% said they try to be close to accurate when they enter their carbs, but almost 40% of people said they just kind of best guess it, similar to an approach you're talking about. And I think the hardest part about any transition is going to be changing your carb ratio when you need to, right? It's always noticing that change. And in your like pre-loop, it was more like, oh, we just needed more insulin and we're starting to need it all the time. And so now it's like you're changing that number. You're having to convert that guess of units to a somewhat meaningful carb ratio in the system. And so changing that is tricky, right? I mean, that happened when Arden came home and I started helping you a little bit. Carb ratio went from like 7 or 8 to like 4 or 4.5. So
Arden's carb ratio is like 4.5 now. And it's because she's super stable away from food. I mean, let's all be honest. Away from food, Loop's amazing. It's astonishing how good it is away from food. It is absolutely amazing. I watched Arden's blood sugar the day while we were off at the baseball game. I watched her blood sugar sit at like 74 for hours while she slept. And I could see it want to move, and the Loop took all the basal away, and it went up to 85, and it leveled back out, and it started drifting down again. And I I could do that myself, but I was killing myself doing it too. Like it was too much. Even this experience that Kenny was just saying, it's helped me talk to people about diabetes because, like, I think looping's amazing, but obviously, against the sheer number of people who have type 1, nobody's looping compared to the sheer number of it, right? Like, and percentage wise. So most of the people I'm talking to do not know what it is. And they are stuck in that world prior to loop. And it's very frightening for most people. There are a lot of people spending their entire lives getting diabetes wrong and being scared of getting low constantly. So it is not lost on me how amazing it is to for this how well this works. So I have never slept so well since my daughter was 2 as I have in the last year. I actually think it might have saved me a little bit, honestly. So I'm excited for what it'll do for her.
Scott, there was one question as how do you kill it with French fries? How do you do so well with French fries?
I use way too much insulin. I use an amount of insulin that I think would take down a Shetland pony, and I put it in there, and I pre-bolus like a mad person. By the way, pre-bolusing with loop it's incredibly important still. And what I find a lot of people ask me is, what do I do when the loop believes that I'm going to be 65 an hour from now and it won't bolus? And I just make a manual bolus. Yep. So that's it. I manually put in a bunch. I let enough of the food hit that the algorithm doesn't think she's going to be 65 anymore. And then if there's any left, we put the rest in. I still think pre-bolusing is incredibly important with this. I'm sorry, I lost the question.
No, you're good. I mean, pre-bolusing, there's all kinds of tricks to pre-bolusing, right? We've tried, you can just manually bolus, like you said. Sometimes I just bolus, like I know food's coming. My wife's making the meal, but I don't know how many carbs it is. So I'm like, well, it's probably no more than, 30, 40 carbs. So I'll give enough insulin for that right now while I'm thinking about it. And then when we get to the meal, I enter the carbs. Sometimes people enter the carbs way ahead of time. Like there's different ways, but you got to get the insulin in. There's a lot of people that post and they're like, well, I thought Loop was going to fix this thing. Is like, well, you're not bolusing before the meal. You can see it in Night Scout. You're not bolusing beforehand.
It's an algorithm that's trying to figure out how to give you insulin. You can't just, that's why I talked about the tug of war still in the beginning, because I think exactly what Kenny said. People thought, oh, this algorithm is just going to fix it all. So I'll put in the number and whatever happens. The insulin still works the way it works, and you need to get ahead of things. And I say to people all the time that, because people like to say, especially with kids, well, I don't know how much they're going to eat. And I'm like, well, they're going to eat something. So find a number that you can believe they're going to eat, and at least pre-bolus that. I talk about insulin, like get it on your side. Get things working in the direction that you want it to get working on, because that food is 100% going to make your blood sugar go up. You cannot just hope it isn't going to. I also run into people a lot who are like, well, I can't pre-bolus. My blood sugar is 75. What? Like, yes, you can. You know, like the way insulin works doesn't suddenly change because your blood sugar is 75. It still takes 15 or 20 minutes to work. People are all the time saying, well, I bolus, and then my blood sugar goes down 5 minutes later. And I tell them, that's not the bolus. That's something you did 3 hours ago that you screwed up. You know, and it's coming back to get you now. But everybody is, I've come to call it like pencil in the pocket now, but there was a Canadian attorney on the show one time, which I think makes him a barrister. And he said that some people see a man put a pencil in his pocket and then rob a bank and come to the conclusion that pencils cause bank robbery. And so when you bolus and 3 minutes later your blood sugar falls, people go, oh, I bolused and my blood sugar. They think that's the cause and effect. And then that stops them from ever doing it again. And when people are so poorly mismanaging insulin, that's inevitably going to happen. And then once that happens, they build this belief in their head that that's that, and then they won't do it anymore. And that's it. And then you're lost forever. You gotta have your basal right. You gotta pre-bolus. You have to understand the impact of food. After that, that's a 6A1C right there, whether you have a loop or not. It just is. So.
And hopefully you get your settings reasonably right with loop. You're sleeping with that 6A1C, getting hours of sleep while also having the number.
So Ken, I sent you a message to say, do you want to address the issues of heavy basal as opposed to a lighter basal, which I think is more the way you go. You want to make any comments?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Scott's doing the same thing. Like he had basal up high, but I mean, a lot of it was, so those of you that have kids that are in school, it happens. You go to school, there's a lot of stress. So increasing the basal is one way to really manage that intensity for when kids are excited or stressed to go to school. So the biggest change was when your kids come home from school, which we've all experienced recently, right? So I think it's not really about a heavier basal or a lighter basal. I think a lot of people end up with a heavier basal when they come to me than they need, because I'm catching people in loops, right? They've already been looping for a while. And a lot of the advice in the looped group is always, well, you got to increase your basal if you're high. There's not a lot of explanation as to why and when. I have a video on YouTube you guys can watch to see how you can use the information in loop to figure out what your basal should be. It worked for Arden too. I mean, Arden just happened to have her period when we were meeting for the first time. So it's just kind of, you're chasing the less basal for like a week or two, and all of a sudden it came back up again. So
can I add to that for Arden at least? Kenny had Arden's basal super low, and he was like, I don't know how, he's like a magician, right? And he had the insulin sensitivity spot, and her blood sugar for days was insane. Like, I mean, like she was just 80 forever. We bolused for food. She was 80. And then as soon as her hormones kicked in, that did not work at all. And so I had to go to a slightly higher basal rate. And I do admit she has a lower basal overnight than she has during the day. But I just found what works. Like, she was getting low at like 2 a.m. and Kenny was trying to help me and he couldn't, we just didn't quite get it. So I just kind of dialed it back a little bit, but I'm a huge fan of starting at 1 basal. Mm-hmm. I think that whether it's loop or not, and if you come to the spot where you're like, look, for some reason between midnight and 3, I get low constantly, then all right, then turn your basal down at 10 p.m. and don't let that happen. Like, I'm not saying just power through, but what I'm saying is that there are going to be a lot of changes for growing boys, or, I say this on the podcast sometimes, and I don't mean it flippantly, but there are some, and I'm not directing this at Kenny, but there are people online who will show you a perfect graph. And I'm like, yeah, that kid is 7. And there's a difference in how the body impacts diabetes when they're younger than when they're older or when you're adults. But I say have that great experience, but just when they hit puberty, don't panic and think that good diabetes is over now. Like, just take what you've learned and apply it going forward. I feel like it's really important to keep learning, see something happen, take something from it, learn how to apply it later. I'll tell you what I tell people all the time is that every time you do something, it doesn't go the way you expected it. And that's how I think about insulin. I think about insulin doing what I meant for it to do or not doing what I meant for it to do. Every time it doesn't do what I mean for it to do, that's a learning experience. And anytime in those moments that you beat yourself up or feel sad or whatever, you've wasted that experience and you're just going to have it again. So just suck it up and figure out what happened and apply better the next time. And that is how I think about it. So, and Brad, I appreciate you nodding your head. It makes me feel very good. Even if you're just like listening to music, it makes me feel like I said something reasonable. So thank you. Seriously, and I saw somebody just pop up, Sarah said, like, it's hard to convince a teenager of that. I hear you. Like, I have the same problem here, but I just don't, when she fails to fill in where needed, then I fill in there. And that's the difference. I just think that, like, I don't want to, everybody's lives are different. And I'm a stay-at-home dad. I have a podcast. I don't have to leave this room and I can make a living. So I know some people are at work and they don't have as much time to apply, but they're kids and they need your help, you know, and it's really hard to have diabetes. And if you're expecting them to do it by yourself, I think you're kidding yourself. Yeah, I really do. So, you know, hopefully they'll get it one day. I'll tell you the other thing too. I don't think of this as being a bummer. We have people on the I have people on the podcast. I don't just talk about the happy part of diabetes. We have an After Dark series. People come on and talk about smoking weed with insulin, drinking, having sex. People have come on and talked about severe mental illnesses that took me by surprise when they came on. I just got done recording with a 20-year-old guy the other day who's bipolar and has tried to kill himself a couple of times. And when you listen to this episode, it's amazing. He got clean and he wants his life to be better, but he doesn't know what to do. And I don't see the difference between him and an 8-year-old or anybody else. This is incredibly difficult to do. And we all sit around, I think we all sit around hoping that our kids aren't the ones that's going to happen to, but something's going to happen to everybody. And you have to be able to, like, stay fluid and go with it. I think diabetes is all about staying fluid, just like that's what life's about. So
I think we say this a lot here. It's a hard disease to manage. You are doing it's unhuman to do what we have to do, and it's constant, and it has so many variables. You can't possibly be perfect.
I also believe that most parents, when they have that feeling of they need to learn how to do it, that really is just fear that when they leave here, they're not going to be okay. It's that idea that you need to learn this before you go, because I do not want to watch you struggle while you're at college. I don't want to wake up in 30 years and find out that, you know, you have amazingly horrible complications from type 1 diabetes because I let you out of the house without knowing how to do this. But that's unreasonable. Like, you can't just make them learn life before they leave. So that you have to teach them how to roll with it, and hope that they're the ones that roll with it, because some people aren't going to. But I mean, if you try to beat it into everybody's head, you're going to make more failure than you make success, I think.
I so look forward to meeting Arden someday. I think you've done a remarkable job, and you share your knowledge, which is...
I could be downstairs cutting heroin right now. You don't know. I could be making this all up. No, she's delightful. She really is great. And I'll tell you, my son's a good kid too. And I think there are times that I've said in the past that, you know, when I became a stay-at-home dad, it wasn't on purpose. You know, my wife and I just had a day where we were apart longer than we thought we were going to, and she used to really like me. So, like, you know, when I came in the door, we had sex, and then there was a baby like 9 months later. It was not on purpose. And so when time came and she was pretty pregnant, we started looking at daycare. And I went out. It was my job to look for daycare because I worked more locally than she did. And I went to a couple, and I came home and I said, hey, I got to tell you, like, just quit your job. Like, I don't want to put our kid in daycare. And she laughed right in my face, because my wife is a way better earner than I am. And if she quit her job, we'd be living 10 feet into the Gulf of Mexico. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we wouldn't even be able to afford a house on land. And so she said, you should do it. I think you'd be great at it. And I quit my job in 1999 and became a stay-at-home dad. And about a year into it, I realized that I was just functionally doing the job. Like I was keeping my son clean and fed, but I didn't intrinsically understand the things that I felt my wife would have just known to do for him, like the things he needed, not just the things that needed to be done. And so I just made this conscious effort to see raising my son as something I could derive joy from. And I let go of all the other things in my life that I dreamt about. And I thought, I'm going to make vacuuming this carpet as important as doing other things that I meant to do. So once I kind of opened my heart up to it and saw it for what it was, it's the best thing I've ever done in my life. It's amazing. And it feeds them. Like, I don't think people would necessarily believe that being at home when they get home from school and just hanging out with them for 10 minutes is important. But I would make sure not to be doing something when my son came home from school every day. And I would make it like I was washing dishes or whatever, but we would just chat for a little bit. And, I'd let him do whatever he wanted to do and be around him. And I've watched that like really pay off, I guess. He's a good person. And Arden's coming along too. But I think it's because I had the time to put into it. If my wife and I couldn't afford to have somebody stay home, I don't know what would happen. I don't know who Arden would be downstairs right now. And everybody's in a different situation. So in your situation, I think you just have to do the best you can do. And like I said, stay fluid and don't say stupid things like you have to understand diabetes before you go back to school at the end of the summer. Like, I don't understand algebra. Like, if you threaten my life right now, I couldn't tell you what the hell that X is for. Like, I just don't know, and I don't want to know, and I'm never going to know. And, I think you got to be willing to see that people absorb and understand things at different rates, and then just hope they do their best. Somebody here's kids not going to do well as they get older. I don't know which one of you it is, but it ain't going to go great for everybody.
So
it might be my kid.
2 more questions for you. One is, what's your advice for potentially managing them, if that's even the right thing to say, at college? If you can even manage them at college, how do you do the balancing, and how do you continue to support her when she goes away? Do you have any plan?
Well, Joanne, I like, first of all, that you're very tolerant of other people's word choices, and that some people don't like the word management on the podcast. I pay no attention to that. So if you don't mind, I just say what I'm thinking, and then I can't, but I like that you did it. I don't see anything wrong with saying managing, but I also don't understand diabetic versus diabetes. Like, a lot of that wordplay doesn't seem like it means anything to me, but I also don't have diabetes. Well, my hope is that it'll go a little bit like it goes. So, I tell people all the time that one of the like kind of dirty secrets of the podcast is that it helps me more than it helps the people listening to it. So I keep building on my knowledge, and then I put my knowledge back into the podcast, and I keep building. So right now, minus Arden's diet, who doesn't have a signal, you can see like I'm following 2 other people. And I have learned how to manage diabetes through text messages like I'm there. And I'm helping those people, but I'm also practicing. So I could take one of your kids or one of you right now, and if you put me in charge, I could keep your blood sugar stable by text. So that's me practicing for Arden being in college, I think. And by that, I mean that I watched my son go to college. He's a great student, and it overwhelmed him. And I just interviewed a 27-year-old girl yesterday who got to college. She'll be on listen, I record ahead, so I'm not ruining anything for you. This isn't going to be out for 6 months. But she was perfect through her teens, A1C in the 6s. Everything was great. She was a model at her endocrinologist. She went off to school, and she didn't want anybody to know she had diabetes. And so she stopped. She started hiding it. And hiding it turned into not pre-bolusing. And hiding it turned into not testing. And then she said before she knew it, she had been through 4 years of college and not gotten an A1C in 4 years. So she went into college with a mid-6 and came out with a mid-12. And she said she would just do what you hear people doing. She'd bolus when she got too high, or she'd bolus an hour after she ate when no one was looking. And this is a girl who grew up 6-7 years with diabetes, had a grade 6 way before even technology. They were doing terrific. And then she got there and, for what, as she explained it to me, seemed like very reasonable decisions for an 18-year-old, and now she's 28 and she found the podcast and she's back into the low 6s again. And she's really excited. But I think that Arden very well may need my help, or she very well may not. And I'll do whatever it is that needs to be done. I'm not judging anybody, but I think a lot of people get pregnant and think, I'd do anything for this baby. I'd step in front of a bus. And I think sometimes the bus comes and people pretend they don't see it. So there's parts of my life that aren't going to be the way I hope they were going to be. And I hope that I can jam enough into Arden's head that she can live a healthy life when I'm gone. And that might include while she's in college.
My final question is, are you coming out with another book?
No. I got offered a second book, and I wrote 15,000 words. I took my money to write my 15,000 words, and I turned them in. And the publisher said that it was great parenting advice. They'd be using it in their own life, but it was too East Coast, and I think I missed the wave. Where, how we a couple of years ago, everybody was just about protecting kids, protecting them, never saying anything harsh in front of them. And now that's trending the other way. I think I had the way it's trending now back then, and it was too different than what was going on. And I have to be honest with you, I enjoyed writing a book. I like that I'm a published author. It's neat when I show up somewhere because people think it's a big deal. I have to tell you, seriously, I'm the same a-hole I was before I wrote a book as I am now. There's nothing particularly special about me now because I wrote a book. It works when I step on stage. They're like, he wrote a book, and people get excited. I reach more people in a day with this podcast than I could reach with a book in my lifetime. And so I'd make this podcast every day if I could. And I see somebody asking me if I recommend other diabetes podcasts. I have to be honest with you. I don't listen to other people's podcasts. I never read anybody else's blog. I think that part of the reason I'm sitting here right now, I hope this doesn't sound egotistical, but I think part of the reason I'm sitting here right now and somebody else isn't sitting here is because I do not do what this space thinks of as safe. And I don't talk about diabetes in a way that is comforting. I don't understand people who say they're triggered by things. I can't even wrap my head around that. But what I found while I was writing is that if there were 600 words of writing on a blog, there were 2 sentences about an idea and 10 sentences about apologizing for it. And then 2 sentences about an idea, and then 10 sentences about why you might not want to do that. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're reading about pre-bolusing. Pre-bolusing is when you blah, 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 blah. Now, that could cause your blood sugar to become low. And of course, when you're low, you might have a seizure, and you should have glucagon around it. By the time you get done explaining away pre-bolusing, who the hell's going to do it? You know what I mean? Like, you've just said this is really important and then made it sound incredibly scary to cover your ass while you're writing. And so I love the podcast because the podcast, I get to say at the beginning, this is not advice, and then I'm covered. And then I can say what I do, right? Because you got to treat people like adults. They have to be able to infer things and apply it to their life. And so I've never listened to another podcast about diabetes. I've never read another blog about type 1. I used to get invited to things. I didn't know those other people when we showed up at events. I don't know how other people talk about type 1. All I know is that there are people who will say to you, that's just diabetes. Oh, you get the 300 sometimes, that's just diabetes. I agree with that in context. I don't agree with it as a rule or a way to live. I think if your blood sugar is frequently going to 300, it's not just diabetes, it's your inability to understand how insulin works. You can't just throw it up to the wind. Oh, that's just diabetes. It's just diabetes. This is what happens when you eat Chinese food. No, it's not. Not if you put the insulin in, right? It's not. And so my goal is to help people. I have to tell you, Joanne, that when my daughter was first diagnosed, that I was a stay-at-home dad, and by the end of every full day, my wife would come home and I would make up an excuse why I needed a shower so I could cry. Because every day I was 100% sure I was killing her. Just every day. And at some point along the way, I figured out what to do and how to talk about it. And I'll be damned if I'm not going to talk about it. People do not have to cry in their shower. They do not have to have A1Cs in the 9s. They don't have to call a 200 blood sugar good. It's easy. I can't believe I'm saying this where I'm being recorded. Once you understand, diabetes is kind of easy. Before you understand, it's the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life. But understanding how to use insulin, understanding that you're on a rolling 24-hour clock, that what happens before is for now, that you have to pre-bolus, to understand food. Once you have it, you have it. It doesn't go away. I can get an A1C in the mid-5s with my eyes closed. Just doing those things. My daughter was a 5'8" the other day, and I was like, oh, look at us failing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you know what a ridiculous thought that is? Like, it's stupid. And look at me. I'm an idiot. Do you understand, Joanne? I don't know anything special. I barely graduated from high school. I did not go to college. I have no ability to make money. Okay? Like, I'm just this person right here. And I can do this. If I can do this, I swear to God, anybody can. I am not kidding. I am this close to being an idiot. I swear to God, anyone can do this. And I can't stand, you want me to soapbox for just 1 second, Glenn? Go ahead and nod if you want it. I can't stand people that go out into the space, purport to be helping people, and keep them afraid to get more clicks on their damn blog. I hate that. I really despise it. I hate people who say things like, oh, you know, I'm not good at this. It's okay. You're not good at it. What the hell does that mean? Like, if you don't have actionable advice for people, shut your mouth. Like, why would you tell people it's okay to be unhealthy? What does that even, I cannot wrap my head around that, Joanne. So that podcast is there because I want people to be healthier. And that's why it's popular. And that's why those other podcasts that I've never listened to are not nearly as popular as this, because all they do is take diabetes blogging and turn it into diabetes talking. It's all parsed bullshit.
I honestly want to say amen.
Thank you. I've been at this a while, Joanne. I know what's up.
Thank you so much.
Brad, stop nodding. It got into my head.
Outstanding. Absolutely love listening to you. You help people. And that's what we think this is all about. So thank you.
I don't know why you'd bother doing it otherwise. There are so many things I could be doing with my life. Like, why would I just be trying to get people to click on things? Like what does that mean? Most of them don't make money with their podcasts even. Like, what's the point of it? You know what I mean? Like, if you're not... By the way, while we're complaining about people, just for a second, if you all don't mind, Instagram, when COVID hit, turned into like, hey, I have abs. I could teach you to have abs for just $60 a month. Or my blood sugar's in the 5s. I could teach you that for $100 a month. I unabashedly accept ads on my podcast because it is a full-time job and I know how people benefit from it. And people should not have to pay for good health. Not from me, ever. You are never going to pay to listen to my podcast. You're never going to have to make a Patreon thing. That's not right, in my opinion. If you have good information, it's America. You ought to be able to find another way to make a couple dollars on it other than reaching into Brenda Moore's pocket and asking her for $80 a month so that her kid can be healthy. That's bullshit, and people that do that should go to hell too. There you go. Now I'm done.
Love you. I was told I would love you. I do. You're also from the East Coast, so gotta like you.
I tried to stand up for you guys so you'd be comfortable. I heard California. I stood in the sun for a while. Are you guys all really from California?
I'm from New York.
Wait,
probably less than half of our group is now from California. Started that way, but
thank you.
Start making good content. People want to come. So
yeah. Hey, listen, if you don't mind, before we go, juiceboxpodcast.com, your favorite podcast app. Please subscribe. Check out the pro tip episodes. I hope you love it. Find me on Facebook. And if you loved what I just said, do all that stuff. And if you were irritated by me at all, please stay away because I don't want to argue with you. And
for those of you that have asked, Scott and I will put together another episode at some point in the future.
Yeah, Kenny's going to come back on the show. Kenny's got 2 episodes are really popular. They're called Fox in the Loop House, right? because his name's Fox and Luke, you understand. And we did, I love talking to Kenny because I meaningfully do not understand how Loop works. And Kenny does. And yet I remember saying something during that episode about driving an RV up a hill or something like that. And I'm just like pontificating on the thing. You have any idea how many emails I get from people who say that analogy like made everything make sense to me? And so again, I'm an idiot, but somehow I say stupid stuff and it helps people with their diabetes. So rock on. And I'm really happy for everybody. People are saying nice stuff about me here, which makes me uncomfortable. I've been married a long time. Please don't compliment me. It makes me feel like I'm sick and I don't know it. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Juiceboxpodcast.com.